Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. We are gonna go ahead and get started. Today is Friday, April 12th, 2024. It's 3:30 p.m. This is panel number 18005, and this is Across the Globe, What's in the News? I'm your moderator. I'm Garrison. I'm the opinion editor for the Daily Camera. So before we get started, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting effects. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. One other thing I'd like to mention is that we want you to be sure to get a chance to ask questions. Here's how we're going to handle the Q&A, which it's Friday afternoon, so I'm sure you're familiar with this at this point. We're using a note card system to receive questions from the audience. At any time in the session, simply raise your hand to request a note card and a pencil from one of our producers. Please write legibly. If you are a student, please note this in your question card. When you finish, raise your hand to hand it to the producer, who will bring it up to me. I urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point. And please ask lots of questions. We have some great people up here, and I definitely want to get them talking about all kinds of stuff. So now I'm just going to do brief, quick introductions of the wonderful panelists here beside me. So right to my left here is William Billy Carney. He is the co-founder of Roca News, a media outlet that is revolutionizing the way the next generation is consuming the news. The goal of Roca News is to help keep people informed and engaged by keeping the news fun, which, if you're reading the news, is difficult right now, so any attempt to do that is good. Roca News' digestible stories have helped the company reach nearly 5 million followers across social media. Next to him is Max Towey, his co-founder of Roca News and the company's current CEO. In addition to overseeing Roca's social media boom, Max has nearly 735,000 followers on his personal TikTok, where he posts about the news and helps to keep the next generation informed, something that is incredibly important right now. And at the very end is Alexander Verbeek. Alex is an environmentalist, public speaker, podcaster, and editor of the Planet newsletter. He just wanted me to say that he is a jack of all trades and does everything. With the climate, to do with the climate and talking about that. So the way that this is going to go is we're going to give each of them a few minutes to talk. Then really we're just going to dive in and hopefully have a really engaging discussion, which is where your questions are going to come in. So if you have anything, please get it up to us so we can keep this interesting. You want to just start here and we can just go down the way?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Billy Carney, as mentioned. Thank you very much, Gary. So I'm really interested today in talking about, of course, what we're going to be seeing in the news over the next few years, but also kind of how it's allowed to be disseminated. There's been some concerns recently with social media and what's allowed to be put on there and what's sometimes restricted. So going through that, kind of, seeing how that would even affect the news outside of social media, I think are some really interesting and important topics. So looking forward to it, and thank you all for coming out here at 3:30 on a Friday.
And 75 degrees with Deion Sanders across the quad. But, we're just a little more charismatic than he is, so I get why you showed up. I'm really excited for this panel. I think there's a lot we've learned. I think people write off young people as not curious and ignorant about the world, and although there may be a lack of knowledge and education in some areas, there's immense curiosity. That trait didn't skip a generation. So we look to activate it in our readers, and I think we've learned a lot on how best to convey world news, and also how we feel a news organization should cover issues and allow people to think for themselves. I think it's tempting to label, provide sort of biased context. I think it's important to give people the information and let them think for themselves.
Wow, this is great. I thought we were going to what was in the news today, so since I don't know anything about O.J. Simpson, I thought that could have been a theme. But I prefer to leave it that way because I'm not at all interested in the guy. What was in the news today is a new report that came out from Swiss Re, the big reinsurance company, and one of the main conclusions is that the United States has the highest cost of all countries in the world by extreme weather events. So anything related to climate change, if you ever think it is about countries far away from you, you're actually hurt most. If you look if you rate it on the gross domestic product of the country, then the Philippines is number one, but still the United States rate as number two. So you're highly sensitive in your economy for climate change. I thought that was an interesting theme, but having heard the previous two speakers, and since if we would vote among the three of us, they would have a 2/3 majority, I fully support focusing on the youth and the news, because that is so very important. And my own hobby horse of climate change is extremely relevant for that use, and it's important that they are well informed. So I think the three of us can form a pact and focus on that issue if we want to in this panel.
All right. Well, since you've pointed us in that direction, let's just kick it off with the most basic one. What needs to change about the news? How do we keep people engaged, and young people specifically, how do we keep them engaged and informed? Or should we?
Yeah, I can kick it off here, and I hear Billy talking off. I'll just go straight in. I think there are a number. I mean, this is not a simple problem. There's not one quick bullet point solution to it, but I think there are a few important premises that we have at Roca and that every news company should have. And I think there is some hope and some positive development taking place in the news space. But I think there are a few things. So number one, I think it's really important to have a politically diverse audience. It's nearly impossible, given the business incentives of news, to convey nonpartisan news with a one-sided audience. So MSNBC, when you poll Americans and say, what's your primary news source? Of those who list MSNBC as theirs, 95% are Democrats. For Fox News, it's 93% are Republicans. And so the incentives there, you're feeding a consumer base in the same way that McDonald's feeds its consumers. And I think that has led to one-sided news, and also the 24/7 news cycle forces you to populate it with sensational articles and fear tactics and everything else that keeps people sucked in to your news notifications on your phone, to the cable news programs at night. And so they have this toolbox of negative things they use to hook us. And I think if you have that one-sided audience, it's very hard to have the discipline to cover multiple stories. Fox is going to hit crime and migrant crime all day. MSNBC is going to give their audience what they want, January 6th every day. And so I think it takes some editorial discipline in reaching out across the aisle to have a diverse audience. And that's why when Walter Cronkite was around and trusted news so high, he knew he had to appeal to the conservative uncle and the liberal niece. And I think that's really unique. And I think the fact that we have a politically diverse audience, Congress members ranging from Cory Booker to Lee Stefanik, celebrities from Mark Cuban and Joe Rogan, we realize that we have to keep it down the middle. And I think we also care enough about our mission, and people realize the news can sometimes be boring, and it can sometimes have stories or facts that don't confirm your priors. And I think that's a healthy thing, and we should let the news cycle disagree with us and be boring sometimes.
Yeah, I'll just add on something here quick. So on top of that, there's kind of, with social media and Twitter specifically, /X, been this flip of journalism where in the past, there were a few people privy to information when something occurred. And if something happened to you, you'd reach out to the New York Times, or they'd reach out to you, and there would be this kind of back and forth, or another media outlet. And they would kind of choose how to disseminate that information, hopefully in a responsible way. Now, if something happens, 7 seconds later, it's on X, and every single person in the world knows about it, and 20 journalists are reaching out to this one person at the same time, asking, can we use your video? Can we use this story? You know, what's your take on it? And as a result, when multiple people are privy to the same exact information, they find themselves, I think, feeling that they need their own spin and their own kind of, narrative to build around this to make it unique. And that's kind of, the natural economic incentive. That's not necessarily, I guess, a bad thing. We can talk about business models separately, but I think it's a reality that we have to deal with now, that people are trying to create stories because everybody has access to the same information, which all in all a good thing, but something to be aware of.
Can I just follow that up and say, how do you handle that?
It's a good question. So how we handle that. So I think, so the problems that we try to solve are, one, the content problem, and two, the form problem. The first, on the content side of things, which kind of we were just talking about, is that we try not to dwell on DC politics, which are the main topics covered by news organizations about 90% of the time. There's so many more interesting stories out there, especially like world news. CNN recently took its world news section off of its website. I mean, that's the most interesting place, at least how we feel, and I think our audience feels that way too. So one, it's just diversifying the content a little bit. We don't need to talk about politics all day, every day. On top of that, on the forum side of things, and this is where we make more of a differentiation, is that we try to meet people where they are. So when we were starting to do what we do on Instagram, for instance, most news organizations they're going to put something on Instagram and they're going to say, okay, now click the link here on Instagram to go see the full story. And the issue with that is that most young people didn't really care enough. Either they didn't care enough, or there was too many interesting things on Instagram to kind of, be bothered to leave. And so having that extra step in the way just didn't really make sense to us. So we started delivering the full entire product on Instagram on that platform. So it's kind of a combination of the two things, of one, a bit more diversity in content, and two, a better form in which it's delivered.
Okay. All right. So kind of jumping off from something you said, Max, how do we deal with bias in the media? Like, how do we, you mentioned, I think, going down the middle. How do you do that? How should we be going about that?
There are, again, I think there are a lot of different ways. Well, there are a lot of things you have to do to cure bias in media. Number one is story selection. A lot of people, when they talk about fake news or bias in media or misinformation, that's not really the biggest concern with our biggest outlets. Not often do they report outright falsehoods. Sometimes they will, occasionally, but they're not calling the sky red every day. That's not how it works. What they do is they narrowly cover a set of stories that lead to false perceptions about the world. And that's why violent crime is down in the country over the last few years. A Fox News viewer would not think that. Now, Fox won't say violent crime is up. They'll cover crime every day and show CVS and Walgreens being ransacked. And so you walk away thinking, can I even go outside in a big city today? And that's not true. The way CNN and MSNBC handled COVID led to terrible misperceptions about the risk of COVID, especially among young people. And they said, what do you think is the hospitalization rate for a 30-year-old? And the average respondent was off by a factor of 10, some by 2 orders of magnitude. And so the result of that is when you hammer stories that align with people's worldviews and that are seductive in a way, fear is a great tactic to keep the TV on. It's a great tactic for that. And so they know that. They're for-profit enterprises. They want to grow every quarter. They want to keep more of your attention, especially in a more distracted world. So they use this toolbox a lot. So I think step one is in promising to your audience and building a level of trust, and also finding an audience that is tired of that wants to have a healthier balance of. So much of our polarization today is manufactured. So much of it's manufactured. And that's a real shame. I think that we need a cooling of the national temperature, even if you're passionate, even if you think one side is crazy and loony and has harnessed anger and resentment in an evil way. You still have to remember that those people are Americans. And I'll tell you what, whenever we get out in the country, I think people are great everywhere. I know that sounds like a cringy political stump speech line, but I really believe it. And I think it's our politics that make us look bad. So I think we can't lose sight of the people, and also show the brighter side of life. Don't just dwell on the negative, even though it's an amazing tactic to get clicks and views.
So we have a question just about that. So what's going right? What is good news in the world? Is there any, if we see so much doom and gloom and fear and
global life expectancy is up 6.1 years since 1960. I think that the access to education, particularly among women and poor groups around the world, has skyrocketed. Frankly, I think a lot of the trend lines in America are negative. Our life expectancy is down, which is kind of stunning. The polarization has ramped up. We thought it was maxed out. It wasn't. And pessimism is higher than ever. The polling on is the country heading in the right direction I know we hear this every year, but it keeps trending down. It's lower than ever. So I think that the spiritual and cultural state of the U.S. is bleak, and I think the media is largely to blame for that. So I think we need to fix that immediately. But I think there are a lot of promising kind of Steven Pinker, world's getting better arguments about the world.
I want to rope Alex into this. Since you focus on climate so much, are there any positive climate news stories out there right now? Anything going well in that realm, or is that also
Well, I can
bleak?
I can think of few positive climate stories and a lot of negative ones. But briefly going back to where we just were, is it really the fault of the media? I think there's a more structural problem behind it in a country where you have so little government involvement and everything is in the hands of companies that are out there to make profit. They will use any trick they can use, except for the few good initiatives trying not to do it that way, but they will use every trick in their toolbox to attract viewers and therefore earn more money, for the very simple reason that that is the way the people that are behind it are judged by the people that have funded them. That is the system the media works in the US. There are other ways you can create different structures in society that you get more fair and more balanced news. And I seem to be the permanent voice of Europe this week. But look at how we do it in European countries, that apart from the commercial news sites that you have, there's everywhere like a government broadcaster, and there's all kinds of checks and balances that broadcaster is bringing fair and independent news. Of course, that's highly debated because you never really know what is fair and independent. And for instance, the British version that everybody knows, the BBC, has been criticized a lot recently, and I think rightly so in some cases. But generally, you see much less polarization in the media. And you can also set norms by government, by laws, on the kind of way that you report in the commercial media. That doesn't mean a kind of censorship in the Saddam Hussein style, promoting Saddam Hussein as the best chosen president in the country of Iraq. Not at all. You have absolutely free media. Actually, we score higher on free media than most countries in the world, in Europe. We're always on top. And that works, and you see less polarization. Now here in the US, society has polarized to such an extreme in a way that in my lifetime I've never seen in the US, and that means that I was born just after the McCarthy days. But it's crazy what is happening here, and it is extremely difficult to now bring biased news. Just to give one example and to loop back into your question about climate change. If you report perfectly neutral that the latest report of the United Nations scientists that work together on climate change, the latest report of the IPCC, concludes that climate change is a really dangerous thing. It is created by people, and if we all take collective action, we can still stop it. If that is the purely factual reporting that you do, then you are presenting a democratic point of view, since all Republicans, without exception in this country, denies that that is true. So it's in this polarized, fake, post-truth society, at least half of this society that we're living in, it's extremely difficult in a case like that to be neutral. So I would be very interested in this example, for instance, how you would report about such a factual issue that has been polarized, but it's still a scientific fact.
Yeah, I think that's a little unfair to half the country. I think that misinformation is rife on both sides, that there are false perceptions on a lot of issues, and there's no doubt that the facts on climate may align with the Democratic Party in the U.S. I also think there are many Republicans who acknowledge climate change and acknowledge human contributions to it. So, I mean, I think that's a reality. In terms of, I also don't think we're far apart on the corporatization of media. I think I agree with you that for-profit enterprises have largely driven this polarization and have led to some bad outcomes in media. But I think it is the news companies themselves. Maybe you could argue to, have a government bureau, but you look at NPR and its trust levels and PBS and news organizations that have been publicly funded in America, and trust levels aren't high for them. So I'm not sure the government is the solution. America's a unique creature. I think when you compare it to Europe, we have a lot that's distinctive about our history, our people, our levels of diversity that a lot of Europe can't compare to. So I think that we do have a sort of interesting, an interesting setup here.
I'll add on here. The business models, as they stand for our existing media, are pretty perverse, right? There's advertising and subscription are the main two for digital media. And on the advertising side, your goal is to get as many clicks as you can. And to do that, you write the most incendiary title imaginable to get people to click on your article. On the subscription front, over time, you build up some pocket of people, and then that pocket of people push you to be more into their pocket, and over time, you kind of shift to that side, whatever the leaning originally of that subscription base is. But in terms of kind of the government funding, as I think, done well, like the BBC or other examples, it is great. On the other hand, a few years ago in our country, there was kind of this push from the Biden administration to crack down on misinformation on COVID on social media. In a perfect world, that's great, that's fine. We want everything to be true. At the same time, we don't always know what is true, and stories do develop over time. And as a result, Meta, who is policing this information, also didn't really know it was true, and their sensors couldn't really pick up on what people were saying exactly. So what would happen is that if you said COVID or vaccine in a post on Instagram, it would get suppressed. You could say, go get a vaccine, it's good, and this is your responsibility. That post will get suppressed because Meta sees the word vaccine or they see the word COVID in a post, and they go, this could be misinformation, do away with it. And as a result, a lot of good information was stifled during COVID, and I think that was a shame. So, can it be done well? Yes. In recent memory, I don't remember it being done well in the US.
I want to circle back to one thing that was mentioned, just specifically dealing with some of the climate issues here. We have a question, how do you deal with false equivalency in politics? So, you'd kind of mentioned the idea that the two parties disagree on climate change. is that a false equivalency? Are we covering it in the same way? How do we deal with that?
Sorry, I don't really get the question. You talk about equivalency. Sorry, I'm not a native speaker. Could you explain?
Yeah, so it's basically like the media treating two things as equal when they may not be. So, for instance, you mentioned that the left tends to believe in climate change and human-caused climate change, and people on the right, in some polls, right, don't always. Sometimes the media treats those two things as the same, right? Because Fox would usually cater to the right. So, and then it also comes down to politics with what's going on and how the two candidates are maybe treated the same when there are some pretty fundamental differences.
Yeah, it's difficult to formulate things right, and with all due respect for what you just say, but if you say the left believes in climate change, I think Obama once said, do you believe in gravity? I mean, climate change is there. You don't have to believe in it. It's science. And there's, in this country especially, there's so much confusion created by the oil and gas companies as if the scientists do not yet agree on climate change. And that is just, it's a sheer lie. The scientists do agree. Already since ages, I mean, already in the 19th century, scientists understood the principles of climate change. Now, scientists by definition never agree. If you put two scientists in a room, there are three opinions. But they have a set of norms, a kind of paradigm where they're in, where they say basically, okay, this part we do agree upon. You sometimes have one scientist that says, I still want to go back and test it again, which is great. That's how you make science. There's a guy who believes that the pyramids in Egypt are built to store grain. Fantastic. Go for it. Try to prove it. Meanwhile, the rest of the world goes on because we believe they were actually made as graves for the pharaohs. Same as climate change. We know that climate change is caused by us, and we know how dangerous it is. There may be details about are we going to hit +3 degrees or +6 degrees at the end of this century or anything in between, but basically we know the basics. Presenting it in the media as if there are two completely opposing possibilities, so you might believe it is true or you might believe it is not true, is a clear lie to the public, and it's actually dangerous because it prevents the US government and the people in the US of taking proper action. And that is exactly what the people that create the confusion are after, because they can still earn money in selling oil. I think as a media company, you have a responsibility to present the right information, and that is the scientific information. Take a very reliable press agency, something like Reuters, which is very traditional, firm in checking things 3 times before they send it out. It's therefore never the most spectacular to click on because their titles are a bit more boring. Reuters will present it to you exactly in this way. Thanks.
Yeah, I think first of all, it's important in media to talk about the various niches you have, and I think for more technical issues where you do need scientists talking about them, I think there's an urgent need for a strong ecosystem of scientific publications. The problem we're solving, and we will report on major climate issues, but it's a more fundamental need of young people simply not getting news or getting it third person on social media from TikTok influencers, from their friends' stories. And there's such a distrust of news. 66% of people in America don't trust the news, varying degrees. It's a stunning number. It's soared in recent years. 50% of Americans now consider themselves politically independent. I think there are a lot of issues and I think a lot of that's warranted. And so our goal is to win over that trust of young people who've turned away from the news and deliver it in a way that's befitting the modern environment, where they don't feel like they take a time machine back to 2008 when they log onto their favorite news site. For us, we want it to feel continuous with all the other apps they use, the social media platforms they use. So we're solving a more basic need. I mean, we're not a climate change focused subject. And I don't believe the truth has a partisan bent. I think there are some issues that have leaned one side and others. I think climate change is a good example of that. So I think it's important to remember that too.
Yeah, of course. Just to I want to dig in a little deeper here because we have a question about it. If the media is to blame, how do you fix it? You're talking about fixing this stuff. So if you can just maybe dig a little deeper into how you're fixing it, especially for the young audiences.
Sure. Do you want to kick that off?
So I would say, in terms of so it's very hard to incentivize the truth. Like, how can you incentivize an outlet to tell the truth? You incentivize them with money. At the end of the day, that's what every company in this country in a capitalist economy at the end of the day is chasing. So I would say freeing yourself from the shackles of a bad business model is the best way that you can position yourself to tell the truth. And I don't think there are many people who wake up in the morning and say, I want to lie. So how do we get to a better business model? So as mentioned before, the two kind of main ones you see today in media are advertising and subscriptions, and they each have their issues. If you want to make a better model, you're going to have to get creative. And one example I brought up in another panel is it's a group called NELK. It's a podcast. They do semi-news, but at the end of the day, it's a podcast. They just kind of these young guys just having fun with each other, and they have some big guests on. They had Trump on, they some big politicians. And what they do is they take a spiked seltzer that they manufacture. It's called Happy Dad, and they just stick it on the table, and they don't even talk about it. But people love them. They love these guys, and it's like their brand. That spiked seltzer, in a very crowded spiked seltzer market, cleared $50 million in sales last year. I mean, that's incredible. So things like that with us at Roca, one thing we do is we have this app. And on the app, it's like gamified news. So you play games and learn the news. Like for one game, you see a picture of a story going on somewhere in the world, and you have to guess where the story takes place, and then you guess, and then you read the story. And people pay for more of those games and kind of this gamification element. So they're not paying for content directly, but they're paying us a subscription, nonetheless. And if you can get people to do that and not pay directly for news, but pay for things that are kind of, augments to your product, I think you can win. It's unfortunate that we're here, I will say, because we've kind of run amok with these crazy headlines, and you see on social media and this tug of war between whatever issue and trying to get more clicks. But at the end of the day, if you can find a way to make money alongside the news instead of with the news, you're better off.
Interesting. Any follow-up to that?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. There's a hierarchy of news business models in terms of the incentives they set up for you, and I think a more community-funded model leads to greater independence. You're not beholden to advertisers, and there are fewer questions. For example, the biggest advertiser in cable news is pharma, and so it raises questions about pharma coverage. BlackRock's an advertiser in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. Do you think they're going to write a hit piece or an investigative article on BlackRock that may be unflattering? Probably not. So I think that there are important decisions you have to make about your business model. And I think, again, there are some positive developments. I would point to Axios. I think they do a very good job. I think they're very serious about sticking to nonpartisan news and keeping it interesting and intelligent and substantive, but also fast. Their big motto is smart brevity. I think they do a great job. And we've received just a deluge of daily messages, emails, et cetera, people saying, I feel better since first reading Roca News, and I feel better informed. You convey it in an easy and engaging way. And so I think the form issue is huge. Otherwise, you have an informational barrier to understanding what's happening in the world if you don't make it accessible and enjoyable to young people, which is our focus. There should be news offerings like that to everybody.
I like it. So because this is, if we are talking about news of the day, there was a recent story about NPR, and we have a question here that public radio hasn't really been mentioned at any of these panels. So I'm curious. You guys obviously are not. I don't think you're from public radio in any way, but
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. But if there's anything, we talked about the partisan. I'm sure you've seen the story about NPR leaning to the left, according to one insider. Yeah. If there's any comments on that, or
Yeah, I saw that piece. I actually haven't read it yet. It's one of my 40 open tabs on my computer right now. But essentially, longtime NPR employee who comes from a liberal background but says we've lost the trust of the American people, which is reflected in polls. And he believes that happened when they started telling people how to think. And I think that is absolutely true. I think that when you are in the business of not just giving people facts and information, but serving it on a silver platter, spoon feeding them opinions, I personally have a higher view of the average person. I think people are smart generally, and that we don't need this sort of patronizing, news company to table opinion delivery system. So I think it's important to present the facts and allow people to think for themselves. And I think if you're worried about misinformation or crazy news companies on the other side, I actually think this is the best way to go about it. I think more stifling of information and discourse leads to more misinformation.
All right, shifting gears just a little bit. There's a question for you, Alex. Since you represent all of Europe, how does the media contribute to the rise in European nationalism in recent years? Do you see any connection there, any correlation?
Oh yeah, clearly. I think the more you report about migrants as being a problem, you immediately get people that say, if this is a problem, we shouldn't have migrants. It's that simple. Now, that in itself means there is a problem with migration because there are different views in society. There's not an easy solution. Let's say if you take both extremes, just closing the border completely is impossible, and it's something that you don't want. If you say we open all of the borders, at a certain moment, the continent is full, independent of where your opinion lies. If you're there, let's say progressive or conservative or left or right or whatever your word you want to use, there are limits to what is possible. So somewhere between a complete lock on the border and a complete open border, there must be some kind of compromise. You have to make choices, etc. But just to stick with this issue, if you focus enormously on it, you will get a reaction. The same thing is when you get polarization in society, a bit on the left, but a bit more visible on the right. No, it's not even left or right. Let's say it's more, let's say, nationalist. That doesn't, in European context, that is a little bit less left and right, apart from let's say the xenophobic element, which you normally would label as right. But if you start focusing in the news on polarization, which is very clickable because it's nice to divide a group in two opposing teams. I mean, it's like what you do with a football team, right? If there would be one team on the field, it would be rather boring. So you bring in another team that tries to score on the other side, and it gets more interesting. That's why I have two tennis players and not one. And so that is how the media works, but there's a responsibility there in how much you focus on what you're doing. Of course, constantly mistakes are made and are discussed, and there's not some kind of absolute truth here. So you need, let's say, checks and balances where you try to find a middle road. And I can imagine that, in your example, that was your team. You're also sitting together, and did we do this right, or how do we present this really as trying to be neutral, which is such a worthy goal, especially for young people. And let me add here, I admire you're trying to create news for young people in a way that young people read it. Because I work a lot with news as well. I got close to 500,000 followers of everything that I send out. But I don't reach enough young people, and we need the young people, especially on, let's say, my core theme of climate change. It will impact them most, and they will be the people that have to solve the mess that my creation and my generation has created. So it's so important what you are doing. Yeah, I can imagine, I don't know, maybe you have examples, but I can imagine that you must have cases where you were sitting around the table, and like this one is really tricky, because whatever we write here, we're immediately judged as being too far to the one side or the other. Thanks.
On the migrant story, I can speak less to European migration, although of course we cover, it's a really bizarre development, I think, especially in Eastern Europe and in the Nordic countries, rise of far-right leaders, especially on the immigration issue. They're not asking to dismantle the socialized healthcare system. It seems that this is the key issue in a lot of the countries experiencing disruption and also oscillating between more establishment, traditional, and then extreme. And that's been a pattern we've seen for the last 10 years or so. On migration in the U.S., in terms of how we cover it, I think, and we take a lot of inspiration from Reuters and in the British papers more than any other. That's our number one. Financial Times, Reuters, BBC. Those are outstanding. They do a better job than America. I don't know if the British system will work in America. As we kind of discussed with NPR, PBS, and just thinking about how polarized we are now, it's kind of like, what does the public news look like when Trump's president versus Biden? You know, it would oscillate, I think, quite a bit. But with migration, the way we've approached it is, we have a third co-founder, and we've covered every aspect of the issue, or at least many aspects. So he went down to Venezuela and Colombia, spent a lot of time with migrants, and learning about the origin of the journey, meeting families. And we still keep in touch with many of the migrants we've met in New York and elsewhere. And I went to Juarez, Mexico, in El Paso, spent a week there, got to know a lot of migrants, also talked to Border Patrol officials, talked to residents of El Paso and other border towns. And you realize there are so many misperceptions about the whole thing, and I think multiple things can be true at once, and it's up to an audience to interpret it. But you realize the harrowing stories of people who make that journey, and they're just truly touching. You meet moms and kids, you meet cousins, and believe me, they're not going to disrupt it. They're looking for a better life, and I think that is very true. Getting through the Darien jungle, dealing with the cartel system in Mexico, which is especially bad for young women, and has gotten ever worse in recent years, according to a lot of the migrants and the humanitarian workers down there. And so you covered that side of the issue, and then you also cover the facts of the border crossing. The fiscal year ends in October, and they are jarring, the number of undocumented immigrants who come into the country in the last 2 years. And I think a lot of Americans are worried about that. And there is, even though there's not a lot of documented migrant crime, there is some, and there's also concerns about what could happen if you have, and there's also evidence that a lot of foreign nationals outside of Latin America are coming into the country. So I think you can report these things as facts, also give that first-person perspective with a lot of the migrants we've come to know and stay in touch with, and again, let people decide. And I think that leads to a much more empathetic outcome than if you're just covering the most fearful, a Venezuelan beat a cop up in New York, and you run that 20 times in one day. And that leads to unjust anger and resentment. And I also think you should cover realities of, Americans seeing the social, but anyways, I don't mean to ramble, but I think by showing the truth in a curious way, it leads to a more empathetic outcome.
I would also just add on to what Max said, and Alexander and I were actually talking about this before the meeting, but kind of like taking an approach that we think our audience finds more interesting is looking at the root of the problem. And also when you look at the root, I think you're able to make, or at least start thinking about real solutions. So like going down to the border, not only, covering what happens in New York with migrants, but seeing the stem of it. Back to, kind of the environment and recycling for a second. So we're running this story in a few weeks, and we could, kind of focus on like, okay, the temperature's up this much this year, and things of that nature. And it's like, okay, that's a lot of doom and gloom, but like, it seems like that's like unstoppable at this point. Like, what are we gonna do? The story we're running in a few weeks is about recycling. And right now, only 10% of recyclable plastic is recycled, which is like, insane. Like, I tried to recycle my plastic, what's happening? In 1970, the US had its first Earth Day. It was like an amazing Earth, 10% of the population participated in it. And that day was the birth of the recycling symbol, the 3 arrows as a triangle. 18 years later, in 1988, oil and gas companies, which are the largest producer of plastics in this country, one of the lobbying groups for them created this thing called the resin identification symbol, which you'll see on most plastics nowadays. This is metal, but maybe you see it on a plastic. And it's almost identical. It's 3 arrows as a triangle, and there's a number inside, and it's a number 1 through 7. And you look at this and you go, oh, wow, this is the recycling symbol. I can recycle this, great. And people started taking all this stuff off the shelves with a clear conscience. In actuality, only numbers 1 and 2 were recyclable. 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, it's very difficult. And so people were buying these products thinking, okay, I'm being responsible, I'm doing my part. But in actuality, you're not. And a lot of this was just deployed by these massive companies, as we were talking about earlier, and these, kind of bad companies doing bad things. Again, it was a lobbying group, but it's you get the point. So yeah, kind of looking at I think the root of the issue and things like that, you kind of get to the culprit of why these issues are being caused.
Interesting. So speaking of migration and recycling and the climate, what is another story that you don't feel like is getting enough attention right now?
Health of Americans. More people have died from drug overdoses in the last 24 years than all U.S. wars combined. How often do we hear that? The most stunning statistic. This includes Revolutionary War, Civil War. And fentanyl is the single biggest killer of men under 50. It's a big group. All ages under 50. Includes cancer, car crashes, gun deaths, etc. I think that we have obviously the opioid epidemic, and today that really just means 70% of those deaths I think 70% are fentanyl. That's an Appalachian issue. Drug overdoses have also soared in inner cities across the country. So I think their health is a major issue on the overdose side, and deaths of despair. And there aren't just, I think, supply and drug and criminal justice issues there. I think there's also a cultural and spiritual issue where in the wake of absent communities and traditional institutions that have kept communities together, obviously a lot of lost jobs, despair takes over. And so fentanyl, unfortunately, is a terrible vehicle for despair. And its supply, which can be fit in the back of 2 pickup trucks and still kill the entire American population 3 times over, which is another one of those, we just hear it's stunning. That is, so I think they're more fundamental issues than just drug, but we don't really talk about that enough. Obviously, people know what the opioid epidemic is. It's been covered for the last 10 years, but it's intensified in a way that news coverage has not shown. And then I think the chronic illness epidemic in the country, I think big ag, big pharma have done a lot of damage, big food, and Americans are pretty sick today. And I think that there's a lot we can do. Not Boulder, but everyone at Boulder seems happy and fit and healthy, and the nature's unbelievable. So as you said, we need more Boulders in the country. But I think health is one issue that comes to mind.
Anybody else on that one?
Well, since you asked about environment, I think what's missing in the news is that climate change can be solved, that we know how to do it, that we can financially do it. We have the knowledge, we have the technology, etc. What's lacking is political will. You get more political will if the people realize that this is actually a solvable problem. And look at the results in the EU of the past few years. It's rapidly getting better just by good governance. I don't believe we do a good job in the Netherlands or in Europe, I mean the EU numbers, but we are rapidly getting better because it is doable. We can solve it, but we have to, all of us, do it. So that positive tone is missing. I understand why, because again, this clickable thing, I mean, if you have like a massive flooding or forest fire, especially forest fires. That's so attractive because who doesn't like a wood fire in the garden? It's nice colors and it moves, and then you have horrible destruction and you have crying people. People click on that. But that's a pity. And talking about the disaster side of climate change, there's not a kind of bias. You have things like, let's say, a forest fire with all its spectacular misery, but you have a lot of growing problems that are slowly getting worse every day that are actually the most devastating. Something like sea level rise. But if you set a camera up on the beach to film sea level rise, you need a lot of film to capture, a millimeter or whatever you call the rate here, inches or whatever in America. But you can't film it, and there's nobody crying on the beach like, the water is coming, and so it doesn't work that way. So there's a lot of biases here in the midst of the panic on terrorism during the war on terrorism. So in the years after the worst disaster we ever saw, this 9/11, but in the years afterwards on the fight on against terrorism, literally, there were more Americans shot by toddlers playing with the gun in the back of a car than any American being killed by terrorists in America. That was literally true. So those kind of statistics are like, how do people perceive risk? So relatively, your own risk of terrorists was extremely small. It was still a massively serious issue because we've seen the worst warnings in the world that you should take. But your own risk walking in the street in Boulder that you would be attacked by a terrorist, we're basically very, very close to zero. So the way the news reports creates all kinds of perceptions. And the negative often wins from the positive, and that creates a feeling of hopelessness. And I think some politicians make use of this desperation, like, well, it's just such a mess. And then they start telling that it used to be so much better in the past. And look at the past, what past? It's never defined as what period was so much better. But in the past, we put little children in factories, and we had slavery, and we had all kinds of other things that I don't want to go back to. So everybody plays with the data that are available, and therefore that makes your challenge so worthy, to especially for young people to try to bring neutral news, but then bring it in a way, they're not going to read the Reuters, so they bring it in a way that they can read it, and they find it on an app like Instagram, which they will open 1,000 times earlier than, let's say, the app of the New York Times or whatever. So yeah, I think you have a huge challenge, and I admire that you try this.
I want to focus a little bit on something you said. I just want to zoom in a little bit here. So one thing that I think is important to the people of Boulder is climate change, and that is something that our community, we've continually voted for taxes that help climate initiatives and things like that locally. But what can a community do to make a difference, right? Because I would say people here don't want to sit around twiddling their thumbs waiting for action on a larger scale, right? We want to feel like we're doing something. So what can a small community do? Anything? Is it... I'm curious.
Well, I don't want to take the mic twice, but since you were looking at me, I think there's a lot you can do in individual initiatives. I was living in Stockholm when a young girl, 16, Greta Thunberg, decided to skip school and sit about 10 minutes walking from where I live to sit in front of Parliament and say we should do something about climate change. Just one person at 16 started a worldwide movement. If a company would have approached me like, we need a new icon for climate change, I would think about, Al Gore, grown big man with a big reputation. A girl of 16 struggling with autism and some other challenges, the last person you would think of to start a global movement managed to spark it and have a lot of influence and really reach young people for quite a few years. It's now a bit less, the pandemic came in between, but she has achieved a lot. So you can do a lot. You can, I think in a community like Boulder, it is already giving a lot of good examples of what is possible. But so something that inspired me, for instance, is this couple in Brazil that came back to Brazil after having been abroad some 20 years ago, and they bought a huge area of land that was completely devastated. Everything was cut off, the fertile land was washed away. In 20 years' time, the two of them, with increasingly help from other people when they got more famous, managed to this enormous area to reforest it, and it looks completely like it isn't 100% the same as biodiverse, but it looks as biodiverse as it was, and it's the best you can get back. Those kind of initiatives show the people that, you know, it's not that everything is lost, but it is that we need to take action now before everything is lost, and we can do it. So yeah, those kind of initiatives are most welcome all over the world.
Yeah, I'm not a climate expert. I will say, by the way, we do love to cover some of those stories that spark a sense of hope. And whether those are reforestation stories around the world, Costa Rica, its success stories on environmentalism. So I think that's something we absolutely try to do. Since, as you said, forest fires get more clicks. And it's not to sugarcoat reality. We never do that. But it is to show that we have agency. The one other thing I would say is I think it's hard to really fight to save something that you don't love. And so I think getting people out in nature and to appreciate nature more is of paramount importance. My interest in environmentalism has surged ever since I started hiking a little bit after college, and being in nature has changed my view. And that might be something you take for granted when you look at these beautiful mountains, the streams, the snow in the winter, the incredible summers here. But I think a lot of people don't have that same outdoorsiness, and so I think to cultivate that is vital. And then all of a sudden, it feels more real, and you are more inclined to sacrifice and fight if you care about it.
Yeah.
As the person from Boulder here, I will say that I think the community has done a good job of that here. I will go out on a limb and say that. Shifting gears just a little bit, I think this one is kind of geared towards the Roca folks here. What are the roles of unorthodox ways that people hear news? Like the example here is memes. Like, do you feel like there's...
It's our meme expert right here.
I'll say, you know, I think to really young people, this wouldn't sound unorthodox, but people are certainly changing the ways in which they consume information, and I think that's going to continue as the young generation gets older into news. So young, like, I'm talking like under 15, like kids nowadays, they're on TikTok, they're on Instagram, they're on Twitch, which is a streaming platform where people play video games, and you watch like people play video games. It sounds ridiculous, it's real. And the kids watch their favorite personalities, their favorite streamers online for hours and hours, and they develop relationships. You know, it's very cordial. Sorry, I meant to say casual. It's very casual. You know, it's people sitting in their living rooms, recording themselves, you know, and talking back and forth in the comments with people. There's not just going to be a switch when these people turn 20 or 30 and say, okay, suddenly I want to watch a guy in a suit on TV. I think these habits are going to continue, and I think over time more and more people are just going to have relationships either with online channels like us or online personalities, and it's going to be, you know, video heavy. It's going to be like you see on TV now. It's just a different medium. So I don't necessarily think the way that people consume news and the relationships they have with the people who are giving them the news will change, but I do think the medium and kind of way they consume it will.
All right, so building off of that a little bit, how would you say this shift in the ways that people are consuming media and the different types of media is going to alter the younger generation's ability to focus and to maybe, when it is important to have that, to dig into that like long form investigation or whatever it may be, will this kind of, these smaller things, will that impact the way that they can focus on other stuff?
Yes, I think that is absolutely an issue. I tended, we, especially since our audience is young, and to sort of quell the fears about how lost and terrible and misinformed the young people are. But I do think on attention issues, it's undeniable. I mean, we don't need, there's a researcher at Georgetown named Cal Newport, if anyone's heard of him, who's a big advocate of deep work and what can happen when you detach from technologies and don't let them rule your life, but instead take charge and are able to focus. And a lot of the great solutions in history and the great ideas have come out of profound focus and silence and nothingness in a way, compared to our hyper-distracted world where it's hard to have that and come up with breakthrough ideas. So I don't know if that may have a lag effect where we'll see the impact of a shortage of great, deep ideas. I do, however, think that there are other advantages. The exposure to different ways of life in different parts of the world with young people today is far greater than it was, say, 50 years ago. I think that's led to a greater sense of openness. I think that people do have profound curiosity who are young. In terms of focus, that is certainly going to be one of the issues, I think, over the next 50 years. I think it's clear that social media has been a Pandora's box. We're just reaping the consequences with its effects on young people's mental health. Depression, anxiety rates have soared, more polarized than ever, young people hanging out less than ever. And so I think that we are learning, okay, social media has done some bad things. So it's time to, I don't believe top-down regulation is going to be a huge part of the solution. I think some is necessary. I tend to be team breakup. But still, I think it's going to have to begin with an awareness at the local, starting with individuals, people understanding the impact of social media and technology on their lives, on their attention spans, et cetera. Also families, starting in the home with education, schools, communities. I think that's the only way you're really going to change it. I don't think Silicon Valley's incentives and the government, which increasingly seems to have Silicon Valley's tentacles wrapped around it, will change that.
All right, so we're in our last 10 minutes here, so I wanted to ask an important one, which is, and this is for all of you, what do you look for in a news source? Like whether it's a story or we've talked about Reuters quite a bit here. How do you trust something? Like what makes you feel confident? Is it just the name, or is there things you look for, or?
It's a bit of both. I think, I look at every news that I read. I look at the source, and some I trust more than the others. There are actually some news sources that I block because I don't trust them at all. Especially if you know that they're funded by another country, which is easily invading another country without any other reason. Those are just blocked. I just don't even want to see them. If I see some from Fox News, I read it in a different way than I read something, let's say, in The Guardian. I look at the source, and then what else do I look for? On the one hand, I look for new facts, a new study that comes out, or something. O.J. Simpson died, it's a fact. One of the few things that's actually true about the guy, because I guess, I don't know, I still remember the scene with the glove, did it fit or not, and there's a lot of them that will probably now never be solved. Facts is one thing. What I read during a day, I love opinions, because I think that's also what makes CWA great, that you hear, you discuss one issue, you hear different opinions, and you filter it, and you shape it, and it kind of helps forming your own opinions. That's something else that I read. Increasingly, and that is not really news anymore, but after having worked for 20 years on climate change stuff and seeing it gets worse and worse and worse, I deliberately look for the kind of information that counterbalances it. I love reading about whatever, your hike in the mountains near Boulder, and that you saw some beautiful flowers, etc. That is not news anymore, but it is still, I like to read that kind of information, so it gets more into storytelling, etc. And in my own writing, I try to combine all three of them. I often start with the facts, but then I bring in context and an opinion, but I wrap the whole thing in storytelling, like a journey that I walk somewhere and the following things happened. So you make it readable and just nice to read. That's what I try. So if I see that a lot of people read it, it's like, hey, I hit something here. So that's it for me.
So I think a few things. I think the name of the news organization matters. The subject also matters. For example, Rolling Stone's music reviews might be a little more reliable than their political essays. So I think the subject matters. And you also see some organizations are stratified in terms of which reporters are their strongest, and also how they break down news and editorial. So the Wall Street Journal, there's a firewall between the two, and the cultures are very different on the Wall Street Journal's news operation compared to their editorial. And so I think it's important to acknowledge all those factors. I totally agree. I think looking at facts, also clicking on sources, even if you're not trained to fully read studies, look to see people who are, read them and see their analysis, because it's stunning how often studies are misrepresented. That's one thing we've noticed. They will use the clickbaitiest thing, something that's a claim and not a fact, and they'll present it as a fact. There are all these issues. So I think always looking at the sources, distinguishing between and always recognizing what is a fact versus what's an opinion versus what's an anonymous source versus what's a more credible public source. I think that's always important. And just as one thing I do before passing along to Billy is always look for another opinion on something, and it's not because the truth is usually one opinion, different opinion divided by two, and that's the truth. I think that's not often the case. I think the truth is often in the middle, but not always. But I think they will often highlight other important considerations when you read the different opinion, and you'll say, oh, I didn't think that, or oh, there's context that I didn't have there before. So you often get that, even if you may still agree with opinion A. But opinion B may hone it a little bit, add a little more nuance, and also, without, again, getting cringe and everybody be happy and unified, I also think it makes you more empathetic to the other person. When you see good faith, smart arguments, not everyone's good faith or smart, but I think a lot of people are, and I think it gives the conversation a lot more humanity and understanding when you're like, I disagree with that person, I have different values, I think this bulk of information outweighs the bulk of information they cited, but I respect that person's opinion. I disagree with it, but it's not a monster, it's their opinion. I like the bolo tie, by the way. It's a great bolo tie.
I think, a lot of great points. I don't have a ton to add. I will say I live more in the social media sphere, and what I normally look for is to see how people interact with the provider of that news. So like essentially the comments section, what people are saying, who's saying it. A lot of people or outlets, content creators claim to be down the middle or nonpartisan, when in actuality they have a side, and it's fine to have a side. I think there's nothing wrong with right-leaning news or left-leaning news. But if there is an outlet or a person who says they're right down the middle, and then you look at the comments and either everybody's wearing a camo hat or everybody's got rainbow hair, it's probably one way or the other. So, just kind of looking at how people interact with it, how they interact with their readers back is what I do.
Awesome. Well, that about does it for us. Thank you all so much for coming out, and give a round of applause for our wonderful panelists.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks
of course.
so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot.